Very much everyone for joining us this afternoon for this panel, which, like Scott mentioned, is focusing on cybercrime laws and their impact on press freedom across the globe. I have a good panel here with me that is going to share insights, and regional perspectives on cybercrime laws and the trends that we have seen, particularly looking at over broad and vague provisions in some of the laws that we have in the different countries and how that is impacting press freedom, but also zoning into the ongoing process of the UN Cybercrime Treaty, and also, just discussing how that will potentially impact press freedom as well, and also some work that has been ongoing around the deliberations and the processes of the UN Cybercrime Treaty. And on that note, allow me to introduce my speakers. And I'll start with Anessa on my immediate left. Anessa Agovic, she's the field coordinator for Bosnia and Herzegovina at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And next here we have Paul Kimumwe, who is a senior program officer at the Collaboration on International ICT Policy for East and Southern Africa, CIPESA for short. And next to Paul, we have Alexander Sribnovic. I hope I got that right.
Close, yeah.
Who's also a field coordinator for North Macedonia at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And next to Alexander, we have Amy Brule, who is the Director of Advocacy at the International Press Institute. And on that note, I would want to kick off the conversation with you, Amy, just to give us a sense of, a global perspective on the issue of cyber crimes, what you have seen in terms of case of digital attacks toward the media outlets and journalists, but also just trends with regard to the regulation of content and content-related and other offenses that are being, regulated by cybercrime laws, and what their potential implications or actual implications have been as far as media freedom is concerned.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nampilo. It's nice to be here. So I think I'm just going to focus my comments first on the scope of the issue, because cybercrime, can be a quite complex but also a technical policy issue. But the regulatory and legal responses can also be very problematic from a press freedom and human rights standpoint. IPI has documented over the past several years, in particular, an alarming spread of cybercrime laws around the world. These laws are often used to target and punish journalists in many places around the world. These laws are being used to silence critical news and reporting of those in power. And this is part of a wider pattern of lawfare or the weaponization of law against the press. However, the cybercrime, I think, is really a two-sided or multi-sided problem. On the one hand, there is a legitimate need to address real cybercrime with legislation. As cybercrime, is on the rise in many places around the world, and there's and the types of crimes we're seeing are more sophisticated and more difficult to combat. And I think probably others on this panel would speak a bit about that. However, on the other hand, there's a trend by governments to use what is a very legitimate problem to pass and deploy overly broad and vague and sweeping laws that can be and are being used to punish a range of online speech that is often protected under domestic and international law. So to focus just really quickly on the first part of the problem, there has been a well-documented rise in cybercrime and in cyber attacks in recent years, which includes a whole range of things like distributed denial of service attacks and data theft and the spread of malware and hacking and et cetera. And these crimes are often quite costly for both individuals and organizations, and require a lot of technical expertise and resources. DDoS attacks, which are a type of attack that disrupts websites by overwhelming them with traffic, are on the rise globally, and are increasing both in complexity and in scale. They also require less technical sophistication and resources to carry out than are necessary to defend against, which creates an advantage for malicious actors. And DDoS attacks, as well as other types of cyber attacks, are increasingly also being used to target media outlets and civil society organizations, and particularly press freedom organizations around the world. And just to mention really quickly, IPI was targeted by a DDoS attack last year for reporting on a string of DDoS attacks against independent media in Hungary. We've also documented an alarming rise of DDoS attacks on media and press freedom groups around the world, including in this region. And then on the other side, we're also seeing more and more governments using what may be the very legitimate problem of real cybercrime to pass broad and vague and repressive laws that can and are being used to target and punish journalists, especially those covering things like corruption, organized crime, and abuses of power. Oftentimes, the laws are enacted also with the aim, the ostensible aim of combating terrorism, the spread of hate speech, religious discrimination, and other forms of harmful speech. But these laws in practice have become kind of sweeping catch-all offenses to punish journalists and whistleblowers and critics. These laws often include very problematic provisions that criminalize things like cyber libel, cyber terrorism, online blasphemy, online hate speech, and content undermining the Constitution. And in many countries, cybercrime laws also now include bans on the publication of so-called fake news. This follows the kind of pandemic era wave of fake news laws that gave governments more tools and opportunities to censor the media. So in addition to punitive measures that often includes fines and imprisonment, many of these laws also enable governments to block websites and carry out disproportionate state surveillance measures and to confiscate journalistic equipment. I won't take much more time, but just as a really quick example, of how the laws are being applied globally. Numerous journalists in the Philippines have been targeted and charged with the country's vague and overbroad cybercrime laws, including Maria Ressa, Nobel laureate, who was charged with for cyber libel. In Pakistan, scores of journalists have been arrested for violating the 2016 Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, or PECA. And in Nigeria, the Cyber Crimes Act also includes bans on cyber stalking, and that has been used to prosecute and imprison multiple journalists, especially in recent years. So unfortunately, the list of examples is far too long to go into, but I'll stop here so we can hear from others.
Yes, thank you very much, Amy. I think what is important also to take away from your global overview is that indeed digital attacks and cybercrime are real, but at the same time, which has sort of created a need or a justification for regulation, but at the same time we see these regulatory frameworks also being used to actually target journalists and suppress fundamental rights. So I want to move quickly to Alexander and get a sense of the work that the global initiative has been undertaking, but also maybe some broader regional trends that you have noted as far as cybercrimes are concerned.
Thank you. My name is Alexander Strminovsky, as noted. So I'm the field coordinator for Macedonia, and as well as the coordinator for the network of experts for Southeastern Europe. Me and my colleague Nessa represent a truly global organization that's active in the field of combating organized crime, organized corruption, and etc., which we like to say for ourselves that we are a networks between networks. The pillar of people working for our organization and hired by our organization and networks are from academia, from civil society sector, and as well, most importantly, from journalism, which my professional background is in that field. So I can speak mostly for our region of work where our organization is active, which I am a part. In Europe concretely, we have offices in Geneva, Vienna, and recently in Berlin. So giving that in mind, and because I originate and I am based in the Balkans, I like to say that this threat of cybercrime, cyber-enabled crime is on the rise globally, but as well in our region. So the global, so this threat to the work of journalism, to the functioning of the states in the region is being noticed by our Global Organized Crime Index from 2023, which noted that the countries from the region, like for example Romania, Albania, and etc., have an average of a risk of 5. And other countries from the region like Macedonia and Montenegro have an average of 5.5 on the scale of risks, which global risk in average it's sincerely more lower than it's in our region, it's 4.55. So not to go into the statistics, but the thing I like to pinpoint with this information of our flagship product is that this concrete region of the world, it's extremely active. Internet, it's a field where it's possible to share information, to gather information, to be active economically, and et cetera, with the global trends that are happening now. And countries are trying to find a way how to resolve the threats active that endangers the work of the civil society sector as well as journalism and sector. So, the trends that we notice in our region will be published soon. We have our risk bulletin publications. Not to give into more details, but the main focal story on the next one, which is out soon in the next couple of days, is concretely on the impact of cybersecurity and cybercrime, cyber-enabled crime in our region. So I will not share much data because it doesn't make sense, but the publication will be up soon. But we can notice that, like for an example, DDoS, malware, ransomware, and all sorts of, and phishing as well, and all sorts of activities are more than present in the region. So, for an example, we have did case studies researches on the incidents, and we can mention some of them. For an example, in the last couple of months, the state authorities' websites in Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, and Serbia were targeted to ransomware attacks, which the states showed a way how to combat it, but then not so effectively in sense of, because, for an example, the site of the government of Macedonia was hacked. The main page of the government was turned into a reselling page of shoes and sportswear. Then we had even more serious notifications of incidents where cyber criminals were freezing assets that the states have, were freezing informations of the citizens, and were freezing and then blackmailing the officials to getting in power the digital tools that are in their disposals. So this is a clear understanding that we all have here, that this trend is active and it's functioning and everything, but to what extent that is going on, as for a journalist, not speaking as a part of my organization that I represent, I have the notions that states in the region have a poor understanding of the crimes. The legal systems are not defined to the narrative that's progressing really fast. And that's why even prevention of the crimes is lacking, because they are not so skillful and efficient combating law enforcement institutions to the level that is needed and to the trend, and perhaps not to mention those situations to be all negative, but if there is better understanding and if there are laws that are translated into this area of effectiveness, then perhaps the threat that we are all facing now could be slightly lower. And maybe the Balkans at some point when this region develops to the needed level will be to the needed average of, let's say, the Americas, like the United States or the Western European countries, or etc. So, for an example, in the period of 2022 and 2023, like only for a year, there is an investigative network called BIRN, which is pretty professional and active in our region in the Balkans, have noticed that the trend spiked on cybercrime in the region, and there are specific tactics that criminals use, how to use the lack of knowledge of the people working in institutions just by clicking an email or answering SMS that it's from an unknown sender on messengers, on etc. And that spiking in trend will surely, if it's not stopped in the future, will make us a significant problematical area. For example, speaking outside of the material that we worked on, how serious the violations are. Yesterday or the day before that, my family members, not me included, received an SMS, a text message from a scammer representing that the government of Macedonia is asking for informations that you will receive help in a state, I don't know how to translate it correctly in English, a state grant for utility space, which is total nonsense. But then somebody got in hold of thousands of numbers of citizens in my country. I'm not speaking for the region, only for Macedonia, which then could be told, you know, how serious and how this problem is so deep, it has so deep roots in our region. Mm-hmm. Not to take so much of the time, perhaps we will speak more deeply into the thematic later on the day. Yes. I leave the floor to other speakers.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexander, for that. I think one of the key takeaways also that I'm getting is this issue around the need for cyber capacity building, which you mentioned, and I think it's quite important also that as we are discussing this issue, we have some thoughts around what should be the way forward and how can we address some of these issues. But I want to move quickly to Paul, and I apologize if you see me looking at you straight through for like a 30 seconds or so. It means it's a signal to start slowing down. But yeah, I just want to move to you, Paul, and maybe just to get a sense of what's happening from the African perspective. Amy sort of also gave insights about what's been happening in Nigeria, but maybe if you can go more in depth about cybercrime laws within the African region, what the implications have been also for press freedom.
Thank you. Yeah, Africa is an interesting continent with the 54 countries or 55 countries, depending on how you decide to look at it. And the terrain in terms of the legal and legislative framework is also very interesting. We tend to copy each other. A lot of times it is word for word. What we change is basically the country and address. But most of the laws are really one and the same, depending on, you just change maybe the language and some bit of context with the people, and then so they are the same. And even before we started having these laws on cybercrime and cybersecurity, already there were fears that indeed governments and their other actors were actually doing surveillance on journalists and for its civil actors. And while, as Amy said, that indeed cyber crimes, cases of cyber crimes have increased on the continent and globally, and there is need actually to regulate and provide for how these guys can be arrested and apprehended. The key issue for us, I think, as a continent is how are these laws made? How are they drafted? Are they a consultative process? And then I think there is what they call in legal language is the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. We need the law, but then how are these laws made? Are they consultative? And do they provide for protection of the rights of individuals? Again, I'll copy these guys. And most of the laws that we have on the continent are very vague, and they are prone to misinterpretation and misapplication. But also, they do not provide for clear oversight mechanism. For example, I mean, if you are going to conduct surveillance, if you are going to monitor somebody's communication, who you suspect to be a criminal, how are you going to do it? Do you leave everything to the powers of the security officers? Are there mechanisms through which, I mean, they should go to court and request for a court order before they can do investigations? No, some of these provisions are not contained within these laws. So they give a lot of power to the security agencies to conduct surveillance and monitoring of communication as they wish. And also they are empowered to go and seize any communication. They can come to your house and grab your laptop because they suspect you to be a criminal. So without any due process. So these are the challenges that we are facing. So the laws are there, but they are so empowering to the security agencies. So there is no way you can oversight some of the activities of these guys. And it becomes a bit challenging, especially. So I will not focus, because it is across the continent. Most of the countries are copying and pasting some of these laws, provision for provision. And so let me focus a little bit on the effects of these practices and these laws. One, they are very chilling on the practice of the media, but also on civil society actors. We did a study 2-3 years ago, but they are very consistent. Every time we speak to our interviews, things haven't changed. So one is the effect on freedom of expression, because this right thrives when people are able to, one, exercise their freedom of expression, they can seek information and without any form of fears. But most of the journalists that we're speaking to have begun practicing self-censorship. And also, we know that journalism, for it to thrive, it's really must get clear and clear-cut sources, especially investigative journalism that we're discussing early in the morning. But many of the sources, especially those working in government, previous whistleblowers, are very scared to interact with journalists because, one, they think their communication is being monitored, and even the journalists, people now fear to speak to journalists, especially those who have been identified as investigative reporters. Anytime they see you interacting with the journalists, definitely security agencies will pick interest in your case and they start following you up. So it affects freedom of expression, access to information, because if the media is scared to cover certain kind of stories, then it means the wider public is going to be affected. They will not have access to such kind of information. Number two, family relations. We had a couple of interviewers who said, I think one of them was very specific, said he lost a girlfriend because the police and security agencies had started following the girlfriend because that they identified her as a soft target for him to get him. So they resolved amicably to separate. And it was a very painful experience, but they didn't have anything to do. And then, of course, cost of communication, because as people are trying to buy VPN to bypass all this kind of surveillance mechanism, they have to inject in more money. And on the continent, we don't have very many people who can afford this kind of software to circumvent cybersecurity interventions. And also, the cost of freedom of assembly, because we know that social media, internet, and communication had eased on how people are able to mobilize and meet. But now you are always fearful who is going to read your communication, who is accessing your private communication. So it becomes costly because now you have to do the physical movements to reach out to people that you want to meet. So the cost of communication has also become very, very, very high. And the other thing is, beyond the laws, our security agencies have been empowering themselves. In many countries, you find that security agencies have undergone a training, mainly by our friends from China, on how to conduct surveillance and communications. We have had incidents where governments have planted software and monitoring equipment in most of the major hotels, especially in the upscale markets, because they know this is where the civil society actors meet to discuss, so they plant surveillance software. This is where journalists meet for workshops or for training, so they have planted. And so there is buying and installing equipment, which is conducting surveillance, but also training their security agencies on how to conduct surveillance. And these are things that you wonder, is it really worth the cost? Why are you engaging in this kind of activities? But basically, they just want to infringe on freedom of expression, people's access to mobilize. And I think, as we've been discussing this morning, it has a wide implication on the democratic practices of given countries, because if people cannot freely communicate, if they can't freely access information, and they can't freely mobilize and assemble, then it becomes very difficult for them even to engage in some of the decision-making processes. So these are some of the things that we've been documenting and not seeing, especially about cyber crimes, cyber laws, and some of the laws are as old as pre-colonial systems, especially in the penal courts, because they criminalize defamation, disinformation, and even in countries where defamation laws have been decriminalized, we find them re-emerging within the cybercrime and cybersecurity laws. For example, in our...
Yeah, maybe you can finish that.
Yes. in many countries, we find that the communication laws, where there are provisions for licensing internet service providers and telecommunication providers, these ISPs and telecom companies are required by law to want to buy and install software that is capable of monitoring private communication. So if you do not buy and install, then they will not renew your license. So even when we are talking to telecommunication providers, they are telling us it is a requirement by government that we are able to buy and install software that will monitor and conduct surveillance on your private communication. So you find yourself in a very difficult situation because these are companies that you want to engage and ask them why are you conducting this. It is a requirement by law. So I think I can be discussing later what we need to be doing in terms of participating in the legal process, making processes as civil society actors, how we can challenge some of these laws. Maybe I can stop there for now.
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. And I think you brought in quite an interesting angle as well, that in addition to cybercrime laws, being enacted and some of them being vague, we also see that with the increase in digital attacks, there's also this justification by governments to acquire and deploy surveillance tools with limited safeguards and limited oversight mechanisms. That's quite interesting also, I think, to take note of. And I want to narrow this conversation down now to a national perspective. I understand, Anessa, that there is ongoing development of cybercrime law here in Bosnia. Maybe you can take us through that as well. What are the actual provisions and what are some of the concerns around that?
Yeah, thank you. I will correct you a bit, but never mind right now. It is a pleasure here to be today and to actually show maybe from the national perspective, since you're here in Sarajevo, maybe to understand better on what issues do we have, but also on what efforts we're doing, which are not satisfying in the end. As my colleague said, Africa is interesting. I have to say, on the other hand, Bosnia and Herzegovina, besides being interesting, is a bit complex with numerous ministries, even more laws and everything around. It is very hard to understand on the other hand, what challenges we do have, but also what efforts are necessary. As in Africa, you're copying in between on provisions. We also copy from the region, but on the other hand, we are gladly to sign conventions, but we sometimes forget that we need to implement it in practice. So they are even more challenging. In that sense, I will give you on some statistics just to understand on why is it important to have important provisions and why is in the end important to really... on the other hand, so for example, only in 22, in 1 month, there was more than 9 million cybersecurity threats registered in Bosnia, which were usually DDoS attacks coming from Netherlands, Brazil, USA, Russia, Germany, and China. And it is interesting that Council of Ministers and Parliament were also victims of these DDoS attacks. But that was not satisfactory or even enough for the politicians to, I have to say, awaken and see that we need to work on this area, which is poorly regulated. Because if we take into consideration that only in 2017 was the first conference on national level regarding cybersecurity at all, in that year we adopted a decision that we need CERT part, but on that sense, cybersecurity emergency response team. But from 2017 until today, there was like very or even non-steps in actually enabling this team that needs to record this incident and work on this area. So today we had very small and initial steps in founding this team. In the end, on what is the main issue, why didn't we do anything about it? Often politicians blame on each other, so there was shift of governments. We will see what will happen further. In the end, yesterday we had a minister speaking at this conference, so hopefully they made more promises on working in that sense. On the other hand, I have to say that on the national level, we did poorly progress, but on the end, since we don't have on the law level regulations, we actually need to do something about it. So from the cantonal to national level, in previous period for the last 6 to 8 months, I was part of working group where Ministry of Interior Affairs on the cantonal level formed a working group to address their amendments regarding the law on the public security. Why is this law linked to this? internet and at all cybersecurity area is that within this law, the idea was to identify internet as a public space in order to provide at least some founding for the perpetrators of the offenses, in sense of like at least serious threats that are pointed at journalists or activists that were already registered in the country, but also in this canton. Before the forming of this working group, there were attempts in the parliament as well, but also in the cantonal government to point out internet as a public space, which was rejected. So the idea of this ministry was actually to gather around journalists, gathered within the media associations, but also press and online media council, with the police, representatives of the ministry, experts in the security, but also of the civil society. The idea was to get through this law and give certain ideas or solutions, so we have at least some kind of consensus that we agree how can we actually have certain, we can say, law to protect people, so not to be used. So this was the main idea of participating people from the media that will be protecting the media in the end. I have to say this working group did a lot of extensive work in the end, but the main issue is actually to point out internet as a public space, and who and how will be later on, like how these offenses will be processed, will they be used against the people who are actually supposed to be protected. In that end, I have to say the ministry was quite open, because they enabled the discussion, they provided space, but also they gave opportunity to international organizations to have a saying, in sense of like what are the good practices and of course what are the pros and cons. These working group gave their conclusions to the ministry at the moment, but in the end I have to say the atmosphere was there to provide to people to be protected, especially journalists who are doing their job. Specifically I was going from my place in that as a journalist working on the organized crime and corruption, which is not an easy job, as you're aware. And I have to say that for now, we will see will the government accept these amendments in the end. And international community was, of course, in this sense divided, but the main takeaway is that we need something, and we cannot wait for the national level to be resolved, because it takes time. It was kind of, I have to say, for the first time that all these actors were included in before drafting in the end this law and sending out to the government. This is an ongoing process, and this was just some kind of example from the local level, and I would say at least a positive process where we had a saying from different points of view. But I have to say that in the end, Bosnia and Herzegovina is countering with different challenges. And from one point of view, I will be quick because you're already looking at me, the lack of strategy, on the other hand, law awareness and the political motivation in sense of to bring out necessary laws, and especially in collaboration with relevant actors as civil society, media, and so on. We have outdated IT infrastructure, but on the other hand, underfunding from our national level, but we have, I have to say, significant international support, but we need more expertise in relevant systems such as judiciary, law enforcement, and in the end, judiciary, both prosecutor's office and the judiciary. I just want to say that within this idea of bringing the law on the local level, at least trying to provide a basis for giving out a criminal offense of a person who misused internet, social media. It had an idea that all law enforcement, that if the amendment of these are adopted, they will go through certain training on understanding, so that in the end this law will not be used wrongly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I mean, you brought some interesting, I think, aspects around the need for public consultations in development of laws and policies. I liked also this emphasis on online safety, because I think one of the challenges that we've had with legislation, particularly in Africa also, is that when policymakers are thinking about cybercrime laws, it's from a perspective of criminalizing conduct, of national security, but very little emphasis on the need for online safety of the people that are interacting on the digital landscape. So I think that's quite important also to take note that for countries that are yet to develop laws, the objective also should be to prioritize online safety. And I just want to shift this conversation now back to you, Amy. We mentioned earlier that there's an ongoing global process around the UN Cybercrime Treaty. Could you just give us a brief in terms of what has been happening with the process, what are the concerns and the potential implications of this treaty on journalism and media freedom in general?
Great, thank you. So there's a very troubling global convention that's in the works and being negotiated now by UN member states. It's been going on for a few years, and it is towards the end of the process of being adopted, the last round of the negotiations are in this summer. In general, I mean, the treaty was first put forward by by Russia and Iran and Venezuela and a group of states with very troubling records on press freedom and internet freedom. And in a lot of ways, the treaty replicates some of the worst domestic laws, cybercrime laws. As it's currently structured, it would probably create a kind of global surveillance dragnet where any country in the world could require another country to facilitate and assist them in investigation of individuals, including across borders. So, for instance, a country could require another country to facilitate real-time surveillance of any person without, currently as structured, without any judicial review or authorization. So this would have really profound impacts, obviously, for journalists in exile. And if adopted, it would also further weaken and undermine, the human rights frameworks that we rely upon. And I think really the UN Cybercrime Treaty is probably emblematic of all of the pressures that the UN system is feeling now and the multilateral system is feeling at the moment. But there are ongoing, I guess, debates about how to ensure that this treaty has some human rights safeguards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much, Amy. And I recall that, as IPI and I think about almost 50 other African organizations, we did make a submission to the UN ad hoc committee around that as well, just raising concerns about the text, the lack of human rights safeguards, the issue of this international cooperation that you mentioned. And so I want to move to Paul to get a sense also of what are you thinking with regard to this UN Cybercrime Treaty, this global treaty, and how it might potentially impact us at a regional level as Africa, in light of also, some of the implications of the national laws that you have mentioned, but also in acknowledgement that we have already in Africa the Malabo Convention, which was adopted in 2014, but only came into effect last year. So what are your thoughts around this global process and how it feeds also into the regional convention and the implications of national laws?
I think it is very troubling, the developments that we are experiencing, because especially for us who are trying to advocate for human rights broadly and definitely internet rights, because most of our advocacy is based on international legal frameworks. So if we are challenging a local national law, we normally make a comparison with the provisions within international framework. So if this treaty passes as it is, then it's going to become very difficult, because again, previously, when you are challenging governments on any provisions within the draft legislation, a lot of excuses is that these are international, we need to contextualize and Africanize our laws. Now, if this treaty passes, they will be very happy to say, well, even the global frameworks provide that we must do ABCD. So it's going to be very troubling for us. And yeah, we are worried that until I think the text changes, the differences are quite clear, as Amy has mentioned. It is going to be very troubling, because you have just spoken about the Malabo Convention. This was a convention that was passed, as you mentioned, 2014. It needed just 15 member states out of the 55 for it to become effective or come into force. It took about 10 years, 12 years later before Mauritania became the 15th country to ratify the convention so it can be enforced. So 10 years later, so much has happened, and some of the provisions are really redundant. And I think we need to be grateful, I think, for the GDPR, because some of the countries and some of the advocacy mechanisms that we have used at the national level has been to refer to the provisions within the GDPR to ensure that our country's laws and policies that have been drafted around data protection, cybersecurity crime, in conformity with the provisions of the GDPR. So 12 years later, when now the convention has come into force, some of the provisions are really redundant and they're not robust enough. So we are wondering, should we now really push our countries to start implementing the convention when most of the provisions actually it needs to be amended? And it is a struggle because some of these conventions are passed in good faith, but then because it is within the powers of the states to really make them come into force, it becomes challenging. So and the convention is not already into force, for you as advocates, you really have nothing much to do. But we are suspecting that if the treaty as it is passed, most likely I think African countries will fight within maybe the next 5 years, because it speaks to what they really are interested in, going against the key provisions and the things that we've been challenging them against. So it is a bit troubling. And for the Malabo Convention, we really don't know how to deal with it, given that it has been overtaken by events. We don't know whether to push for amendments just as it is coming into force. So it is a bit challenging, and we are struggling how to harmonize our thoughts around that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. I think you raised quite interesting points around the role of civil society and the reliance on international standards and international instruments to influence local processes and to influence policymakers. And I think one key point which is important for the UN Cybercrime Treaty is that if this treaty and its provisions do not have sufficient safeguards, authoritarian states, particularly in Africa, where we've seen already patterns and trends of abusing these laws, might rely on that international instrument to justify local legislation that undermines fundamental rights. And I think that's something important that, at global level, we need to make sure we set a very good standard. Otherwise, at national levels, authoritarian states might rely on that. And I want to close this off by giving Alexander and Anessa the chance to speak also about the Budapest Convention, maybe just reflecting on what its role has been and maybe whether or not it has been a sufficient mechanism also to influence addressing cybercrime laws at national level.
Well, the term that I heard from our colleague and speaker, to Africanize the laws, perhaps maybe we need to Balkanize the laws and measurements for our region. So my point is that the convention there exists as one form of a mechanism for reducing for vulnerability of cybercrime and cyber-enabled crime in the region. But it's kind of specific when we speak about the Balkans, because we are the countries that are present in the region are different than in other parts of the world, meaning some of them are members of security umbrella organization NATO, and all of them are either members of the European Union or are going through the process. And like, for example, my country, Macedonia, it's in a way between. We are a member of NATO, but then we are struggling to be a part of the European Union. Why I say this? No, because it's a form of a mechanism that combats this threat, in sense of the EU is asking for our countries in the region to harmonize the laws, combating all sorts of types of crimes, including that one we are discussing now. But then countries do have the tendency only to accept documents, which is a regional conclusion, and then not to put them in practice, or not to put them in practice in the need of how it is in the field. And priorly, when I was speaking about the results of the Global Organized Crime Index, we can see that the need is high. We have the legislative and the documents, but then on the end of the day, there is no harmonization, and combating this threat is not put into practice.
Mm-hmm.
I will just again reflect on my own country, and I will say that in the example of Bosnia and Herzegovina, we need to absolutely and necessarily develop regarding cybersecurity, adopting the cybersecurity strategy. Then we have to provide laws on the organization and on regarding the state level, providing on what are the competences of the country, how to fight against cybercrime, and in the end, capacity building of the personnel. On the other hand, with the Budapest Convention, it provides like collaboration that urgent matters, but Bosnia needs to align our legal framework with the Budapest Convention, but certain changes have been made as on the entity level, not again on the state level, but our criminal laws and laws regarding criminal procedure do not regulate all the criminal acts that can arise through cyber. On the other hand, we are the only country in the region we don't have a cybersecurity strategy, and the consequences regarding of inadequate approach on the cyber crimes and fighting overall this form, it is showing again that we need to, on the other hand, emphasize the capacity building of the judiciary and the law enforcement, but we need to this prerequisite upfront. As I would just note on one practical example, as new technologies brings a lot of, we can say, opportunities for criminals or perpetrators of the cybercrime. Also, new technologies open up new opportunities to trace these crimes, and the judiciary must be ready as well as law enforcement for these challenges. Lately, as you are aware, we had the decryption of Sky application messages that we, with the support of Europol, we opened up a lot of investigations, and in the specificity of this Sky application in our country, it enrolled a whole new level in sense of drug cartel, which is important at the global level, doing cocaine trafficking from Latin America and Africa towards Western Balkans, in the end going through EU and forwards. And this cartel would not be uncovered, we can say so, if we didn't have, we can say, opportunity to get this Sky application and later on, of course, build upon the cases. But it is important that this drug cartel led by Tito and Dino was actually for the last period, according to the prosecutor information that was publicly available, they were actually making their own new secure platform for communication. And they were just a couple steps ahead just to put it in, we can say, working place with the servers that were here within the country and also in the Emirates. So we can imagine that they had this opportunity to make their own communication safe and secure. So how would be ready not only our country, but also countries in the region to fight against such powerful, we can say, criminal groups?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I'm being reminded here that I think I have like 2 minutes left. But I think in closing, I'm appreciating what the panel has been saying, that, you know, indeed, cybercrimes are real. Digital attacks are there, including towards the media, towards journalists. And while there is a need, you know, for regulation, for policy frameworks, we also need to ensure that those frameworks do not open up avenues for unlawful surveillance or avenues for undermining of human rights. And I think that that would be quite important. And I want to use the last 2 minutes maybe to open up to the floor. If there are any comments, I know that we have, I think, 2 of our colleagues here, Zafa and Hamadu as well, that have done some work around that. So I'll give you maybe each a minute also to just share your insights around that.
Thank you. Stand up for the camera. Yeah, Amy briefly talked about the cybercrime law in Pakistan, which was introduced in 2016. What many people don't know is last week, the government came up with another much more stronger law in the name of a defamation law. And almost all journalists and civil society organizations have described it as a draconian law, which if it is put into force, it will be a death of free speech in the country. Now, what we believe in Pakistan, the journalist fraternity believe, is that terms like cybercrime and cybersecurity are being used to stifle free speech. And this is happening in Pakistan, in India, in Bangladesh, in many African countries, and it will continue to happen. Our campaign has been that if there is a problem, and there are problems, come and talk to us. Come and talk to the stakeholders. And unless you discuss the issues with the stakeholders it will always be regarded as a move to stifle the press. And today it's one government, tomorrow there will be another government, and it will continue to happen. This is our view, and we will continue to campaign about this.
Thank you very much. I know that Hamadou did a research. Hamadou is at the back there. He did a research also on cybercrime laws in the Sahel region in West Africa. You can briefly tell us also about your findings.
Well, almost the same. What we found, I mean, the way we did was to try and see what the international laws were saying, what was the international standards, African Union laws, African Human Rights Commission, and of course, other international laws, and what the current cybercrime laws were stating. What was interesting is most of the countries we studied, Senegal, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, you would imagine that 3 of them are now under military rule. All of them have some constitutional statements allowing press freedom, stating that freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and so on and so forth. But thanks to these cyber laws, they managed all to sort of withdraw all what was granted to the press in terms of freedom. So I think mostly that's it. Plus, at times, issues that were not probably not directly addressing media issues, but which would affect the media. For instance, internet shutdowns. In all those countries, we have experiences of internet shutdowns, the most recent ones being in Senegal. And of course, also media censorship based on these laws. Based on these laws, the threat to state security, to personal data and things like that, governments would use those laws to somehow stifle press freedom. For the sake of time, maybe I'll just stop there. And if people are interested, the study is available online. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can continue the conversation over lunch, but thank you for joining us, and allow me to hand over to Scott, our MC.